Tried and true vampires who, while little more than fiction in the minds of many today, were very real threats in the past. For around a century, pockets of New England experienced outbreaks of tuberculosis, with some unfortunate families falling ill one right after the other. When 1800s medicine failed them, their fear drove them towards supernatural explanations. They and their communities often believed that the dead were sapping the life from the still living, resulting in a plethora of bodies being dug up and burned. Not everyone in New England believed in vampires so readily, and more than a few reporters called the entire thing absurd and distasteful. But stories of vampires sell and garner a lot of attention, even if they're not super well known today. I'm Olympia Stoker, your mostly friendly vampiric moth scholar, and today I'm putting together an appropriately edgy cross-stitch pattern of a coffin dripping with blood. The design quite literally came to me while I was half asleep, thinking about what I might do. As I say it now, I can't help but smile because it's frankly a ridiculous idea, but I'm doing it anyway because I designed it myself and it's fun. Although some of the floss I'm using for this project is DMC, the majority of my stash was thrifted or gifted to me. I firmly believe that you shouldn't be scared to mix up colors where you want, or even just try to match as closely as possible with what you do have. There's really not much need to go out and buy a whole new collection just for a little project. This stitching project really only took me a handful of hours, and while I will admit now that my technique wasn't perfect, it was still fun. First up should be a clarification of what a vampire was in the minds of 18th and 19th century New Englanders, because it most definitely wasn't the glittering disco balls of Twilight. The concept of a vampire who haunted the night and drank the blood of innocent women, as seen with tales like Carmilla, didn't even come out until the late 1800s. The last case we're covering today, that of Mercy Brown, happened 5 years before Dracula was even published. So, what was a vampire? More than likely, New Englanders' understandings of vampires came from Europe, notably Serbia, though the term vampire likely took root when the Hartford Courant first published the definition in 1765. In 1725, a Serbian peasant named Peter Plogojavac, I tried to pronounce it, please don't come at me, who deserves more time than I can give him in this video, died. And 9 people in his village died after him. He was later deemed a vampire, with the sign of his hair and nails apparently growing. There was blood in his mouth and fresh blood in his heart. Peter wasn't the only case, and he, in subsequent following cases, traveled pretty far, reaching the New World and New England at large. These stories became superstitions, with grandparents sharing it with their children and their grandchildren, and so on and so forth, as folklore tends to do. Vampires didn't walk among the living for these people. They weren't beautiful and sparkling in the sun. They weren't trying to buy real estate. They were already dead and buried. They weren't rich counts or doctors. They were your friends and your family, whose spirit had been warped and perverted so that they could drag you down with them. And it was genuinely believed that vampires attacked the spirit, and by consequence, the body suffered. Given that consumption, also known as tuberculosis, failed to be physically treated by physicians, people turned inward. If it couldn't be physically treated, then it must be a spiritual disease. George Stetson, a Christian pastor and religious writer, wrote in January 1896 that, "In New England, the vampire superstition is unknown by its proper name. It is their belief that consumption is not a physical but a spiritual disease, obsession, or visitation. That as long as the body of a dead consumptive relative has blood in its heart, it is proof that an occult influence steals from it for death and is at work draining the blood of the living in the heart of the dead and causing his rapid decline." Really long sentiment, but it gets the point across. However, tuberculosis is very much a physical disease, but when the best treatment offered to you is to run off to the mountains for fresher air, something that would have been difficult for the average person to do, you get a little bit desperate. For those who don't know, Tuberculosis was originally dubbed consumption because, according to the National Library of Medicine, the disease appeared to consume the affected person through substantial weight loss and wasting that primarily affects the lungs. Those who are sick from tuberculosis may not experience symptoms, but if they do, it quite literally looks like their sickness is consuming them, which is terrifying. So they dug up their dead in fear. Where medicine failed, they tried to take matters into their own hands. Rhode Island folklorist Michael Bell has documented about 80 vampire exhumations that took place over this period. The cures for these vampires ranged from ripping out the roots that grew in their graves and bodies to taking their hearts and other mostly not decomposed organs and setting them on fire. The fear of the dead gripped the heart of New England, fueled by aforementioned superstitions and the general lack of success of medical professionals. Although there are exceptions for the young and old, generally the dead who were subject to exhumations and being accused of vampirism were young adults. Although most of the well-documented cases I've opted to cover are women, there really isn't enough evidence to forge a strong connection between women and accusations of vampirism. Well, except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island has been noted to have almost specifically targeted young, recently dead women with their accusations. Let the men be vampires, Rhode Island. Stop trying to gatekeep the dead. Of course, regardless of who was accused and whether or not there was an implied misogyny toward the dead, digging them up and burning them didn't cure the sick. But that begs the question of why the narrative of vampires continued. Were the dead mistakenly blamed for a secret vampire in these towns? Or were vampires even to blame at all? Before we dive into the first case, a quick look over the stitch and where we are with it. I know for a fact I messed up my stitches a bit. In theory, you really should have all your stitches going the same way, but I get kind of lost in the sauce while I'm working, and it's really easy for me to lose track of what direction my stitches are supposed to be going. Doubly so if I'm stitching with black floss, which I am. Still better than working with black Ada, which feels almost impossible to see on. Also, don't worry too much about how pretty the back of your cross stitch is. More than likely, you're going to be covering it up anyway, so I mean, if it's ugly, who cares? Unless you want to display the back of your stitch, but that's weird, and unless you're posting on r/cross stitch, it's likely that nobody else cares what it looks like. I say this mostly because I don't care what the back of my cross stitch looks like. Back to business. The first case I want to cover is that of Rachel Burton. She died in 1790 and was exhumed in 1792, known post-mortem as the Manchester Vampire. Although we don't know much about who Rachel Harris Burton was before she died, we do know that she was considered to be a beautiful and lovely woman. She married Captain Isaac Burton and passed away from consumption in 1790, only a year after her marriage. And then 1 year later, Isaac married again, this time to Huldah Powell. Huldah, just like Rachel, also fell ill with consumption. Something a little sus going on here, or it's just a spot of bad luck. Nonetheless, immediately Isaac and Huldah's friends, family, and community turned to Rachel as the source of Huldah's sickness, believing that she had become a demon vampire who was sapping away Huldah's life force. What their exact reasoning for why Rachel was sapping Huldah's life force was never clearly documented. Perhaps they believed that Rachel was upset that Isaac had remarried instead of remaining a widower. Or perhaps they believed that Rachel was taking Huldah's life for her own to come back and take her place at Isaac's side once more, because we all know that women's lives revolve around their husbands even after death. To fight this newly suspected demon vampire, the people believed that they needed to exhume her and burn what remained of her vital organs on a charcoal fire. Of course, as soon as her coffin was above ground, there really wasn't that much left. Liquefied organs, rot, and bones, and that's about it. Even still, the people persisted, and as noted by Judge John S. Pettibone in his manuscript on the history of Manchester, up to 1,000 people were present to watch the defeat of the demon vampire. Given that the population of Manchester was around 1,300 at the time, it seems that everyone in town had to get a look at the supernatural force that was supposedly sapping the life of her husband's new wife. However, not everyone bought into the vampire panic. Judge Pettibone, who documented the affair, basically claimed that the entire thing was strange and ridiculous. Hilda soon became ill after they were married, and when she was in the last stages of consumption, a strange infatuation took possession of the minds of the connections and friends of the family. They were induced to believe that if the vitals of the first wife could be consumed by being burned in a charcoal fire, it would effect a cure of the sick second wife. Such was the strange delusion that they disinterred the first wife, who had been buried for about 3 years. Pettibone was justified in his skepticism, given that Hulda did not survive and died about a year after they had dug up Rachel's body. Even still, the fear of vampires persisted, regardless of how successful the cure turned out to be. Fortunately, though, no more blame was laid to Rachel after she was exhumed and her organs burned. There were many more exhumations between Rachel and the second case I want to cover, some of which were well documented. However, our next case, that of the Jewett City vampires, warrants special attention. A quick look at the stitch, and we're making good progress. Finally found a camera angle I actually liked, where my hand didn't occasionally blot out the entirety of the screen like a flashbang, which is nice. You might be curious about why I'm opting for that upside down cross, and it's because I thought it would be neat and appropriate. After all, traditionally crosses are supposed to repel vampires, so why not invert it? If vampires are supposed to be the perversion of the gift of life, might as well make that really obvious. The story of the Jewett City vampires begins with the deaths of the Ray family, each one of them passing to consumption. First was Lemuel Billings Ray, who died on March 9th, 1845 at 24 years old. His pops came next in July of that year. After that was Alicia, who died on February 1st of 1851, less than 6 years after his father and brother. When Henry Nelson Ray fell ill with the same disease as the rest of them, not even 3 years later, his family began to grow desperate and started suspecting that it wasn't just poor luck, but a nasty supernatural force that was attempting to drag their family down. Given the record of vampires spread across New England for just over a half-century prior to this, it seemed only natural that they would come to the conclusion of vampirism among their people. To try and pin who the culprit might be, all 3 of the deceased Rays were dug up, but only one really had the finger pointed to them as being the source of the family's misery. Despite being the most recent to die, and ergo not the cause of his brother and father's deaths, the blame was pinned on Alicia. There are 2 newspaper articles from the time that share slightly different stories, however. One claims that both Lemuel and Alicia were burned, while another claims that only Alicia was burned. Whatever the case, Alicia was most certainly accused of being one of the living dead. With him and his coffin burned, the people hoped that it would ease Henry's ailment. Unfortunately, this did nothing to cure his consumption, and Henry died the same year, with his wife and children soon to follow. Again, just like Rachel's case, the exhumation and burning of the brothers' bodies, paired with his family being convinced of superstition, was considered to be strange and incredibly superstitious. A Norwich courier later wrote in the paper stating, "We seem to be transported back to the dark age of unreasoning ignorance and blind superstition, instead of living in the middle of the 19th century and in a state calling itself enlightened and Christian." He called the ritual a strange and almost incredible tale of superstition, and clearly found the entire thing ridiculous, bordering on despicable. The last case that I want to cover here, and by far the most infamous, is the case of Mercy Lena Brown. Mercy Brown, commonly referred to as Lena by her family, was one of the last known vampires in the Great New England Vampire Panic. She's well known enough that it's very likely that Mercy's death and subsequent treatment after death function as partial inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, given that several newspaper clippings regarding her death were found in his home. 8 years before Mercy's death, in 1892, she lost her mother, Mary, to consumption. 2 years after Mary's death, the oldest sister, Olive, died, also to consumption. A handful of years later, and her only brother, Edwin, also fell ill to consumption, though he left to Colorado Springs just a year before Mercy died. After Mercy's death, Edwin returned back to Rhode Island, only to grow even sicker with every passing day. Pressed by his community and surviving family, George, Mercy's father, was pushed to believe that the only reason his family could fall prey to the same disease over and over again was because of a vampire in their wake. Although a news article on the situation noted that he tried to hold off for as long as possible, he eventually caved and went through with an investigation. Desperation drove him to any option available, especially when medical professionals failed to give him an answer. It's worth noting now that Mercy Brown died during winter. The ground would have been far too cold to dig up a grave, so they opted to store her casket above ground in a mausoleum, at least until spring when she could be properly buried. The investigation into who may have been a vampire in the Brown family took place in March, with George's wife and 2 daughters being exhumed. Both Olive and Mary were little more than skeletons, incapable of drawing any kind of life from the rest of the family to try and fuel their own undeath or reverse it. Mercy, however, who had only been buried a short while ago, was a prime candidate. Although she was at the point of decomposition that she should have been in, having been relatively well preserved during the winter, it was noted that when her heart and liver were removed, they were dripping with blood, that her nails and hair were longer, and the blood pooled in her mouth similar to Peter Plogojowicz. Again, I tried on the name. The doctor doing the autopsy noted that this was to be expected, but George and the people attending the investigation went ahead with the process to destroy the vampire anyway. Why? Because you can't trust medical professionals, at least during this time period. You really can't fault them for that. However, the account in the Providence Journal is to the point and lacks the flair of other accounts, which leaves the scene feeling less vicious than it likely was. Other accounts note that Mercy's body was ripped apart, her heart and liver stolen and burned on a nearby rock until there was little more than ash. Afterward, Edwin apparently took the ash and mixed it into a potion, with the hopes that it would cure his consumption. His little stint at witchcraft was short-lived, and he died only a short while later, which you think would exonerate Mercy, but apparently not. Even still, one has to be absolutely baffled by the thought process here and amazed at what desperation can drive people to do. Mercy fell victim to the same disease as 3 people before her, and yet she still bore the brunt of the blame. If the dead really were sucking the life from the living, then Mercy doesn't fit the mold in the slightest, as she was alive when all of her family members grew sick and when 2 of them died. But desperation and fear overpower logic, especially when your life is on the line. So, with those 3 cases in mind, was it really the dead sapping the life from the living, sickening their relatives with the same disease they fell prey to? Well, no, it very obviously wasn't. In most cases, the person who was sick still ended up dying, and as noted in both Mercy and Alicia's cases, they weren't even the first in their families to die to consumption. Where did the living even think the life the dead was leeching was going to go? Into making extra fertile soil? But those kinds of questions don't matter in this situation, because it's not about logic and rationality. It's about fear, desperation, and the need for answers. When medical professionals fail to make a situation better or cannot provide a solution, people turn to desperate and often dangerous measures. This is one of the few morbid incidents in history where the living weren't harmed in the process of trying to seek answers. More often than not, though, the brunt of people's ire and fear is turned towards unfortunates, who cannot defend themselves against the accusations. The dead and dehumanized certainly can't defend themselves. So, if it wasn't vampires, what was it? Obviously it was consumption, but it could just be bad luck, or consumption was going around and their genetics weren't predisposed towards a healthy immune system. But misfortune rarely leads to acceptance of luck of the draw. If you take anything away from the Great New England Vampire Panic, leave with the idea that it's okay to be scared and not have answers. They will come in time, but you can't let yourself be enraptured by things that could be frankly dangerous to yourself or to others. Thinking that vampires are undeniably real is fun, but it's just not realistic for every day. And with that, our cross-stitch and this brief look into the Great New England Vampire Panic are over. I know this stitch isn't perfect, and it's rather small because I wanted to finish it in a single day, but it's one of the first cross-stitches I've ever drafted myself, and I'm proud of how it came out. Every cross-stitch is a new learning experience, especially since I'm self-taught. If you want the pattern to this stitch, I have a PDF in my description. If you're looking for more information on the Great New England Vampire Panic or some sources on vampiric history in general, my sources are in my description, as well as some suggested reading. If you enjoyed this little peek at a fascinating area of history, the creative project, or both, feel free to subscribe, like, leave a comment, or whatever your heart desires. This will, hopefully, be the first of many great things to come. See you all later.